Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about switches and blend modes, which is these are some of the finer points that you can add to a motion graphics composition to make it look a little bit more professional, and also to avoid some of these things that make you look a little bit like a piker if you're if you're not careful. So let's take a look here, and we'll talk about. First of all, let's talk about some of these switches here. These are some of these, a little bit of up until now, this has been a fairly puzzling area of the interface. We don't really know quite what these things do. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and press Control A to select all of these, and I'm going to roll them back up, which is a fairly quick and easy way to kind of compact this view so that you can see what's going on here. So if you recall, if you recall from before, we had this composition here where we have a plane flying in and we have the mountains, if you remember this, right? So it's interesting, and I really like it. I like the way it's coming together. We've got a couple different problems, though. First of all, if we go ahead and we take this up to 100% visibility, and we look at it, it's a little bit tough to see, but these mountains are we got a little bit of a blurry edge on these mountains here. Anything that's a little bit too much larger than 100%. Let's see if we've got anything else here that's bigger than 100%. Yeah, the plane's a little bit larger than 100%. You can't see it too badly here, but just for the sake of emphasis, let's go ahead and make this plane really large. Remember when we talked earlier about something being something having a very limited resolution? Well, I promised you that these would not be resolution, that these vector graphics that we worked so hard on would not be resolution dependent. And I'm about ready to make good on that promise by clicking on this button here that says there's a certain button here in the interface that is called continually rasterize. Let's hold that down. You can see continuously rasterize. You always want to do this with your vector layers. Try to do it strategically, but for the most part, maybe you can see a difference. Yeah, it's a little tough to see a difference here because it's just not that much larger. However, remember when I went through here, this is what it was with it off. See how we get that really blurry, nasty line? Well, watch what happens now when I continuously rasterize it. Interesting. I don't get that blurry line anymore. Now, okay, this is, it's a little bit more processor intensive to continuously rasterize things. So if you're not making anything larger than 100% of its normal size, you could skip it and save a little bit of processing power. But for the most part, as a rule of thumb, I like to turn it on just so I can have this full control over things. It's a little hard maybe to see from this video, but my mountains are actually looking a lot better too. You got a little bit of a blurry edge here. It's tough to see, but I can go in here, and when I continuously rasterize it, it looks a lot better, especially when I really want to scale it up or do something different with it. So continuously rasterize, that's something that you can apply to vector layers to make vector layers look a lot more professional, and it makes them infinitely scalable. The next thing we'll talk about is motion blur. And motion blur is another thing that's really important to include in your motion graphics compositions. Some people like it, some people don't. Most of the time, you're better off using it, rather than going without it, because it's just something that people expect to see nowadays. So it's just, stylistically, it's just something we've come to expect. So if we watch right now, we'll notice that, we've got hard lines with our layers coming in here, but what we can see here is that we can put a little bit of motion blur on this plane to give it a rather zippy quality, make it look cute, or give it a stronger illusion of motion at the very least. So one of the things that we have noticed here is we have toggle switches in modes. So I don't know, I think most of you will, I think by default you may open it up and it may have these switches here, but if you can't see them, you can go ahead and click on this button down here to toggle between switches and modes, which I do quite a bit of. When we talk a little bit later about matting, you're going to switch this back to track matte mode, and when we talk about blend modes here in a minute, we're going to talk about switching it back to a mode here. So that's what this button is critical for, is clicking on that to go back between switches and modes. So we're going to go back to our switches. Something else is we've got a motion blur switch. Simple as that, right? So I can click on that motion blur switch there, and that, that applies motion blur to that one layer. However, that's not enough, right? So I've applied motion blur to my plane, maybe to make it look a little zippier, but I'm still not seeing the motion blur. What you have to do is you have to enable motion blur for all of the layers that have the switch set. So you do that by clicking on this one button. Now you'll see in mid motion we've gotten a little bit of this linear blur here in the direction that it's going. So let's run this back and see if it makes a big difference, right? See, now our plane looks a little zippier, right? It's a very small difference, but it's very small, at least from this level, but it really does make a big difference, especially when you have lots of moving objects, right? So let's go ahead and apply it to the rest of these, and maybe we'll see a little bit more motion blur kind of pop up here. Yeah. And really, you see it on the speech bubble a little bit, right? The plane's really prominent. With this, not so much on the mountains and the cityscape. You see a little bit of it, but that's something else that makes things look a little bit more professional, is applying motion blur to them. It's the kind of thing where, if it's missing, your client may, not be able to put their finger on it. They maybe go, it looks a little different. But applying motion blur is something that is, will add a little bit extra value there. Some people are driven nuts by the motion blur in After Effects, but I, for one, think it looks good, and I typically apply it to most things that I do, especially if you're trying to make something look punchy or cute or something, make it look, rather stylish. The nice part is that, one of the drawbacks to motion blur, though, is that it can be processor intensive. So by toggling this switch up here at this level, you can actually turn it off for all these layers while you're working and you're comping things. You can just pretty much say, oh yeah, this is going to have motion blur when I'm done, but for the time being, I'm just scrubbing through it and I'm working with it, I'm still keyframing. I can turn the motion blur off just with one single switch. Very handy dandy, so that you aren't zapping processor cycles trying to get through here to properly get your thing set up. While you're waiting for the motion blur to go, when you know what it looks like. So turning this on and off is a good way to kind of toggle the motion blur. So the final thing that we're going to discuss here are blending modes. And if some of you have worked with this in Photoshop, then this may be a little bit of review for you. But blending modes are incredibly important when it comes to manipulating the color as it passes down from layer to layer. You'll notice that we've got different layers here, right? And really at the moment, the layers are just put right on top of one another, right? Nothing crazy. If this is green, then if it's on top of the blue, then, well, it's going to appear green instead of blue. And it really depends on what pixel. It really is a way of determining, blending modes really determine what color, what pixel is going to be at what time. Which, pixel math can get a bit heady, so we won't go too deep in the weeds there. But it is important to know that it does involve the math equation of what pixel does when it's on top of the other, right? And that's really why they get the names for the blending modes. So as a primer, let's go here, and first thing we're going to do is we're going to toggle between switches and modes, right, from down here. So we're going to toggle over to modes from switches. We were over here in switches working with motion blur, but now we're going to toggle over to a mode. And you'll notice here we can toggle the blending mode on all of these different layers. So I've got my speech bubble here. I can go ahead and I can apply an additive blend mode. I can do anything like that. Well, notice that it doesn't really do anything. Well, there really isn't anything for it to add over top of. So really, we're not really doing a whole lot right now by changing the blending mode. I can go up here. Let's change it back to normal. One thing that's interesting, though, if you recall from our Photoshop file, I had this really interesting texture here. I've been eyeing it, and I'm thinking it might look pretty cool back here, adding a little bit of visual complexity to what I'm doing. So this is interesting because I can make this a much more interesting composition just by adding this texture in here. So I've already taken the liberty of preloading this in, this one little layer in. Let me grab it and drag it underneath of what I've got here. Okay, well, this is interesting. It's giving me this little paper texture. I can move it around. I just kind of want the texture. I don't want too many lines. I don't want something that's too distracting. So this is interesting. Now I've kind of got, visually it fights a lot. But once I start changing the blend modes, I can actually have it darken or lighten based on where it's where we're looking at it. So what pixels lay over top of what pixels. So I'm going to go here to the blending mode, for example, let's start with the plane. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick a multiply blend mode. Well, now this is really interesting because we can see some of the texture coming through. So what this is doing is this is taking all of these pixels that are inside of this plane and it's multiplying them against this texture here. So actually it looks like it's painted onto the raster graphic. So here you go. I mean, as much as I've been hyping vector graphics, I can tell you that they're very important, but you know, sometimes they're not quite as important as they can be if you add them over top of raster graphics. So we want to use these things together, and we want to work with them in a manner that is the most beneficial. So what if I take this speech bubble and I add an additive blend mode to it? Well, basically it's going to take the pixel color in here and it's going to add it, or it's going to lighten it up based on where it falls here on this raster image. So we're starting to see some very interesting effects, and this is starting to look a little bit more like a blended together composition that has a little bit more visual character to it. So we're upping the ante quite a bit here. So I can go ahead and I can put an additive blend mode on that. Another blend mode which is very common is overlay. What overlay does is it adds the stuff that's above a particular threshold and subtracts the stuff that's below a particular threshold. Today it's not really giving us an interesting result with the red. So unfortunately, we're going to have to move on from there, and maybe we can apply color. You can play around with these on your own time and see what they do. I can apply saturation. Still nothing interesting coming out of that. I would prefer maybe to multiply it, right? And the mountains, it's a light color, so we'll definitely have to multiply that or do something to kind of give that a certain look there. So just by changing some of these blend modes here, we've actually made this a lot more interesting, and we've added a texture in the background, right? So we've got this paper texture, and by tinkering with these blend modes, and I do encourage you to tinker, there's a lot going on here. Soft light's another one that's very interesting, right? So I encourage you to go in here and tinker with these different blend modes to see the different effects that you get out of them, and you'll eventually find yourself coming up with some pretty interesting results here. So go ahead and play with that and see what you get, and add some visual interest to what you're doing with a blend mode. So here's what it looks like if we go ahead and we scrub it. And interestingly enough, we're starting to get a rather interesting composition here that looks fairly more visually stimulating than what we had before. So just some things to keep in mind when you're doing here, and consider how maybe you can use some of these blend modes to make your compositions a little more interesting.